Welcome to a video on C# basics. In this video, I'm going to talk about thinking in objects. As we've covered across these videos, we remember that C# expects classes, expects objects. We also know that we can use public and private variables to describe the relationship between one object and another, how it can access public things and how it cannot access private things. We also know we can use methods, sets of instructions to do things. We can pass information into a method using its parameters and use a return statement to get information back out. We also know in C# we can use the get and set keywords to construct new members that can get private information by being public. Finally, in this video, we're going to start to put all of these ideas together and start to discuss the relationship between more complex objects and objects within a group. We can group objects within C# using a namespace. And in fact, I have been describing using system, something I've talked about in every video here, as a library. But that's not strictly true. It is in fact a namespace. And we can see we're now using a namespace starting on line 6. A namespace encapsulates all of the objects that it contains. So we see that here. The namespace is defined using the namespace keyword examples and is 6 all the way through to 48, enclosing both main class and, when we look at others, those other objects as well, to put them all within the same namespace, which means that they have a relationship to each other and can talk to, that is, use public methods and variables from each other. But before I get too far, let's just review this quickly. So we see a namespace is what all of these classes and objects are going to be within, and I've been using and describing using system as using the system library, but it's in fact using the namespace called system in which other things are found. So we see in our very first file, we're using examples. Examples is our namespace in which everything will be found. Now let's take a second and jump over to person.cs. I've created a new file called person.cs that contains a public class called person. This has the same code as the previous video, and in fact we'll notice here private string underscore name, private string underscore ID, and we're using get and set as we did in the previous video. But it is now part of the namespace examples, so it means other objects within this namespace can reference this. So we see this is all within namespace. So let's move over to programmer.cs. Again, this is within the same namespace of examples that all of these are within, and so they can reference each other. This is a little bit different, and this helps us to start thinking about objects. Within object-oriented programming, a type of programming paradigm that C# supports, we think of one object in relationship to another object as either a is a or has a relationship. That is, either an object is another object or an object has another object. We start to see that here. On line 4, public class programmer : person. This describes a is a relationship, and in fact I've written that as a comment right here. Programmer is a person. So we can use person as a template for programmer. Programmer is a more specific version of the more generic person. Or if we want to think them in the family dynamics, person is the parent and programmer is the child, which inherits from the parent. So we see here programmer : person. A person is or a programmer is a person. And we see it has a private variable string underscore skills. We see down here within its constructor, remember a constructor is a special type of method that allows us to build an object, name, ID, and skills. So name and ID is from its parent or the object it is. We then use a special method called base, which sends the name and ID into the constructor of the parent, or the object it is one of. So we see in this case, we call the constructor name, ID, and skills. We send to its base what it is inheriting from, name and ID. Well, we know programmer is a person. So if we go look at person, scroll down to its constructor, we see it takes name and ID, and it assigns the parameters name to the private underscore name, the parameter ID to the private underscore ID. Back to programmer, if we do base name ID, it does those two actions, and because this is another object, we can say this underscore skills is equal to skills and pass in this as well. And we see this uses the same idea again, get and set as part of C#. So a private string underscore skills, public name skills that gets and sets this underscore private data to programmer. Because programmer is a person, we can call the base and set the name and ID which it inherits from its parent person through using the method base and passing those two parameters. So a programmer is a person, and we have a person object right here, and both programmer and person are within the same namespace, so they can communicate to each other. Coming all the way back to main, we see main class is within the same namespace, so it knows person and it knows programmer. Programmer is a person. Person is the parent or from which programmer inherits. So let's scroll down and look at main class. So we see the similar thing we looked at in the previous video. We're creating a new object demo of type person, and within the constructor, which is a special type of method, we see demo and 1234 as both strings that are being passed to it. So we know we can access demo, and in the previous video we saw we can access demo.name and demo.id because these are special type of methods that look like variables to allow us to change the private data using the get and set keyword. If I scroll down even more, we see something new. Now we're creating a new object called demo2 of type programmer and passing in three things: name, ID, and skills, which we saw when we looked at programmer. Name, ID, and skills. But we're calling using the base method name and ID, so those will be set. So let's jump back to main. So name, ID, and skills. We see down here console.writeLine, demo2 name, demo2 ID, demo2 skills. But as we saw, programmer only defines skills, but because programmer is a person and name and ID are within person, then it can use those because it inherits, it uses its base. So coming back to main, we see these relationships in action when I click run. We see demo 1234, which we saw from the previous video, using name and ID as public to get private data. And we see down here with programmer, name, ID, and skills, which are public to get private data. Demo 2, 5678, and knows C#. So I described objects as either a, is a, or has a relationship. Previous to now, I didn't describe the has a relationship, though you might have guessed what I meant by that. In the case of main class, which is the class within this file, these are examples of has a object. Main class has a person, and main class has a programmer. Demo 1 and Demo 2. So these are an example of has a relationships. Main class has a person and has a programmer. These are two different objects, person and programmer, in which main class has. These are different than the relationship between person and programmer. Programmer, as I've said multiple times, is a person, It is the base, or is the parent from which it inherits. So we can use programmer like a person because it is a person, whereas in main class, we describe these relationships between person and programmer as has a. Main class has a person, main class has a programmer. So we describe these two types of relationships thusly. So let's review all of this. As I mentioned, starting from the top, system isn't technically a library, it's a namespace. So we can use the namespace keyword to wrap objects within a project. So C# understands that those objects have a relationship to each other, some type of relationship, in which we can define within the code themselves. But we're saying group all these things together using the keyword namespace and making sure we wrap everything we want to be a namespace within those namespaces. So we saw namespace examples in main class, in person, and in programmer, telling C# to group all of these classes, to group all of these objects together. We also saw within person that we can define a public class and use the same code we've used in the previous videos to define a constructor and use the get and set keywords to define a public way to get at private data. We then saw within programmer that programmer is a person and so inherits name and ID and the name and ID public ways of getting at private data. Using the base method, we saw we can send data to the parent or base constructor to make sure those values are set as well. So we needed only to define skills within the constructor for programmer, and then define a way to get and set the data of skills in the same way we used it within person. Finally, coming all the way back to our main class we've been using throughout this entire series of videos, we saw we can create a new object demo of type person, sending in demo and 1, 2, 3, 4 as two different strings. And we can get at name and ID because those are public ways to get to private data. We see the same idea within programmer, demo2, name, ID, and skills. Because of the use of base method, we can set name and ID within that core of programmer because programmer is a person. And finally, we can get at name, ID, and skills because these are public ways to get to private data within an object that is another object. Thanks for watching.